Okay. I think everything's working. Oh, microphone. Oh, goodness. Alrighty, let's jump in here. Sorry about the delay. I was reconciling budget numbers and I got so engrossed in that engrossing task that I was like, oh, I gotta go to class. Okay, so today we're gonna keep talking cultural worlds of the different generations, and I think we made it up to millennials last time. So I will ask you, if you are here or if you're maybe live streaming it online, if you could, I'm just going to leave this up for half a sec, if you could just log into the Slido, because I have a couple of sort of interactive elements built in. I've never done them with a class this size, but I thought it might be fun to throw some stuff at you, get you to answer some questions, and think a little bit about where you're situated on some of these questions as well. So if you can just log into that quickly, and then when we come up to it, you'll see there's a couple of interactive elements that are going to pop up as we go through today's lecture. And I changed the code from last time because it wasn't working, but once I reset the Slido code, everything was working properly. So it's this one for the rest of today, and I think we'll be done this today entirely. And then we're going to move on to family. I think it's families. Families is next. Yes, I think it's families, then education. Okay, so I'll give you 2.5 more seconds to do that. All right, how is everybody doing today? Doing okay? Any questions about the course? I know next Wednesday is going to be the midterm, right? So you get today's class, Wednesday's class. Monday there's no class because it's the long weekend. And then Wednesday you come back and it'll be the first midterm for the course. And on Wednesday of this week, I will go through a bunch of practice questions with you, just so you see what the questions kind of look like. And I see that some people have already kind of taken a look at them. I think 10 people have already gone through the practice questions that are posted on eClass. A Vancouver jersey, that is a bold choice on this day, sir. Well, I know, but don't you fear mortal danger? Okay. You're brave, I see. I'm not an Oilers fan, so I have no stake in the game, but I remember walking around St. Petersburg, in Russia, at one point, and when I had been in Moscow, I had bought a t-shirt for one of the Moscow soccer teams, Spartak, and I was wearing it around St. Petersburg, and as I was stepping out of the door of our dormitory, the kind of dormitory guard lady, this old lady, stopped me and she said, okay, you're going to want to go upstairs and change. And I'm like, why? She's like, because if you go on the metro in that t-shirt, you're 100% going to get the shit kicked out of you. And I was like, duly noted. And I went upstairs and I changed. So, I mean, none of that stuff happens in Canada. We don't have soccer hooligan culture, but I still think a bold choice. Okay. So maybe I'll double check, see if we have any questions. No questions so far. All right. So this is kind of where we left off last time, right? So we've gone through the silence. You obviously went through the history of youth and childhood last Monday. I went through the silence. So a couple of generations. I went through the silent generation, the boomers and Gen X on Wednesday of last week. And then, we come up and we sort of left off with the beginning kind of questions about the millennial generation, right? So just to recap, sort of where we were, when we leave off Gen X, I guess if I go back one other slide, we're talking about, declining social trust being one of their meaningful characteristics. As the social fabric sort of broke down for them, the economy got worse and social inequality grew over time. And talking about the millennials, right, one of Twenge's assertions with the millennials, and she's done a lot of research on them, is that in general, especially the early millennials, probably born about 1980 to 85, showed really, really strong kind of markers of narcissistic personality, right? So very self-centered generation, kind of, in a lot of cases, their parents were the baby boomers, and this generation that got very into self-help and self-affirmation and all of that fun stuff. So all of that grew when it came to the millennials, as did, of course, stress and anxiety. Okay. Apathy in terms of politics, pretty marked for the millennials. A belief that nothing can really change. I don't want to hold myself up as an example of my whole generation too often, but I remember when Barack Obama was first running for election, everybody was like, man, this is going to change the world. This is going to transform politics. And I was just like, seems like a pretty normal politician to me, because I'm a millennial and I'm apathetic and kind of cynical about elections and all of that fun stuff. Okay. Sexualized self, kind of following that same trend as Gen X, right? Millennials were a generation that had sex for the first time relatively early, right, when they were relatively young, and had this really short childhood and this really, really long adolescence, got married relatively late, but we were having sex pretty early. And we're more comfortable with a sexualized kind of self. And a lot of their understandings of self ended up being driven by, our friends, whatever I wrote here, the internet. I don't know why it looks like that. My E and my R grew together to make an A, so now it's the internet. The internet, right, and especially, adult content, internet pornography in all of its diverse forms. And I guess this last point, important. Diversity, whatever, which I love at this point from Twenge. Basically, prejudice, around things like gender, race, sexual orientation was something that for the millennials really became taboo, especially as they entered kind of late adolescence and emerging adulthood. But, and I like that she stresses that it's no big deal. It was seen as just the kind of norm, right? It wasn't like millennials conceived themselves as doing something exceptional in terms of their tolerance. It was just the right thing to do, to be tolerant of everybody. Okay. So most of the millennials, right, grew up with the internet fairly pervasive in their lives, right? So, that earliest, right, so it's 1980 is the beginning of the generation. 1995 is roughly our start date for the internet in terms of like a consumer product that people could purchase and tended to have in their homes, right? So you could, at first it was dial-up internet, and then broadband internet came a little bit later. But, so the oldest of the millennials were 15. So well into adolescence by the time the internet became sort of part of everyday life. 1995, pardon me, would have been the time that schools started to get it, in the school library. Public libraries would have started to have, computers with internet access as well. So for millennials, right, from kind of the oldest millennials in their teens, and then every, the next 15 years or 14 years of the millennials, the internet would become more and more pervasive and more kind of normal in their experience. So they're probably, according to Twenge, the first digital generation, right? And sometimes millennials have been labeled digital natives. It's a term that got tossed around a lot for the millennials. The first kind of digital natives, or the first generation that grew up with digital technologies and the internet in particular as part of their lives, right? So, this was cast in early, one of the fields that I've studied is communication studies or communication and media studies. And this was a big deal, kind of in the late 2000, like the late aughts, I guess, the 2000 to 2009 period. People were talking a lot about this distinction between digital natives and digital immigrants, right? And the digital immigrants were Gen X, the boomers, and the silent generation to the extent they used the internet at all. And the digital natives were millennials and everything after millennials. Now, I think this distinction ends up being less meaningful. You can come and take So 444 with me in the fall term, if you can get in, where we will talk about this kind of distinction and how I don't think it's all that meaningful, because a lot of things end up being black boxed, where millennials are comfortable with technologies, but they don't really use them. Like, they don't really understand what goes on behind them, right? They're not really good at coding, and they don't really understand what's behind a lot of these technologies. But it is the first generation that spends a big part of their life in the digital world. Okay. It sounds like the Digimon song. Okay, I'm back. All right, the first ones to experience social media, though this will be relatively late, right? So this is probably the youngest of the millennials when social media really starts to appear, which is, somewhere, I want to say around 2003, 2004 is sort of the early point where you get things like MySpace, kind of coming, and then Facebook, I think, is about 2006, becomes widely available. So a good chunk of the millennials are in kind of late adolescence, early adulthood, when social media really becomes important. And Facebook and Twitter, probably the first two that really break through. And then, you get your Instagrams, your Snapchats, and all those other things, which are really more part of the experience of younger millennials, and of course, Gen Z, which we'll talk about later. Okay, millennials are really, compared to other generations, highly educated. 1 in 3 have at least a 4-year college degree, right? So a third of the generation has a 4-year college degree and lots of other degrees. And we're earning more on average by 2019 than the 3 previous generations did at the same point in their lives, adjusted for inflation. So when you hear millennials bitch and gripe about the fact that, oh, it's so hard to be a millennial, wah, 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 we got screwed by the Great Recession and all that stuff, it's actually not entirely true, right? In terms of how much income they're taking home, and again, owing a lot to this actually, right? This 1 in 3 that have a college education, compared to previous generational cohorts, they're doing pretty well financially. Okay, so slow life plan right here. Because they have fewer children, right? So millennials will have a lot less children than other generations. So we're seeing probably like the last chunk of the millennials now are in their kind of early 30s, roughly, and we got a chunk of our Gen Z in there. But like in Canada, roughly speaking, we're talking about 1.3, maybe 1.4, depending on the year, children per woman. So it's a really, really low number, well below replacement. Okay, so generally speaking, they're having a lot fewer children, so they have a lot more disposable income, right? They have more to spend, and they're investing a lot of that in the fewer children that they have, or things like vacations and all of that jazz. And, they do have less wealth, if you count wealth in terms of things owned, stocks, bonds, all those things, than other generations did at the same time, especially the boomers, but they are catching up really, really quickly, right? And generally speaking, on the whole, they went to school for longer than boomers and Gen Xers. So they started saving and buying homes later, and homes are a major generator of wealth. But they're catching up really, really quickly, right? By 2019, they were only 11% below. By 2023, they're almost even with where the boomers and Gen Xers were at the same point in their lives. And what's probably going to happen with millennials is they're going to, by the time we hit 5-10 years forward from here, millennials will be doing much better than Gen Xers and boomers did at the same point in their lives. It only took us into our 40s to be doing better, but we are. Okay, so yeah, I mean, millennials aren't actually poor. They do complain about it a lot, and this is, what was the meme a few years ago? That millennials were poor because they ate a lot of avocado toast, right? Like this was the massive cost of avocado toast and Starbucks coffees. Millennials are not actually poor. Millennials are doing rather well. They do face a high cost of living, right? And this is obviously exacerbated in 2023, 2024 with the kind of inflation crisis that we've been facing. But especially if you look at kind of their lives, we're front loading a lot of the cost, right? Where then millennials end up paying stuff off over time. That's the same for Gen Z. You're paying a lot for college education, college tuition, or university tuition early on. However, that tends to lead to higher earnings later on, right? So in the US, it's worse. In Canada, it's not nearly as bad because I know you probably are going to balk at this statement, but our tuition isn't that bad in Canada. Balk, if you will. I mean, you're not at Harvard where, you know, all in for a year at Harvard, you're probably spending $80K, you know, or even a state school where you're probably spending about 20 per year. But, you know, obviously it's still expensive. You still pay a lot in tuition and all that jazz. But definitely, you know, that higher cost of kind of education. And, you know, I guess not just the cost of education. I won't write this. I'm going to put my pen in my pocket. It's the time, right? One of the problems with a college education is its time. Is you give up probably about 4 to 6 earning years, depending on how fast you go through your degree, where other generations already would have been in the workplace, right? And you're going to get higher wages as you progress through because of your education, but you start a little bit behind, right? Because you spent more of your years being educated, right? So you know, 18 to 22 at least, but maybe 18 to like 24, 25, depending on how much education you do. So you're spending an extra number of years getting educated where you're not earning a whole lot of money. So you start a little bit behind, you end up having debt, so it takes a while to kind of catch up. Okay, why do I have the Kardashians on here despite having never watched an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians or anything related to the Kardashians? Because I think, you know, part of the story of millennials, and especially this will be true for Gen Z as well, especially with social media, is the fact that millennials had pretty high expectations of what they thought their lives were going to be. So for one, they came from really wealthy parents, right? The baby boomers, you know, because the boomers lived through that huge period of economic expansion, you know, and the oldest of them would have been kind of able to earn money on the tail end of that, establish their careers on the tail end of that big economic expansion that happened 1945 to 1970. They did really, really well. So the boomers have, you know, cottages, vacation homes, boats, RVs, and all that jazz. And so because that's what they saw out of their parents, millennials ended up kind of thinking that that was the world. Okay, so they have these sky-high expectations that aren't maybe connected to these objective indicators of actual wealth or actually how they're doing. And social media might play a role here as well, right? Because social media ends up creating this weird culture, which I'm sure you're all aware of, where people, you know, kind of broadcast how well they're doing. My wife has a cousin like this. She's really annoying. Where literally every Facebook post is about how wonderful her life is, and look at our beautiful house and our children and our new RV. When you actually talk to her life's a shit show. Her kids are, you know, have learning disabilities, and they're spending tens of thousands of dollars on kind of doctors and you know, tests and all this stuff. But on Facebook, boy, does her life look perfect, right? So a lot of that plays in, right? And it's like, oh, look at us, we're in our vacation home in Invermere. And it's like, okay, I'm in my vacation tent in my backyard. What are you gonna do? By the way, go to grad school for 9 years. It's not going to necessarily mean you can keep up with all the people who buy RVs and vacation homes. Just FYI. PhDs are fun, but also you give up a lot of years of earning. So, yeah, social media plays a role. People project, you know, and there's image curation on social media. That means people are always kind of putting the best image forward. And millennials then look, and I mean, sometimes it happens, right? You see someone off on their vacation in Greece on Facebook, and no matter what their life is actually like, you know, you get this impression that you're falling behind. I don't like them. They're evil. I don't know why. But their name is very close to an evil alien race of space Nazis from Star Trek. So We're going to go with that's probably why. Okay, so slow life. Compared to, especially the silents and the boomers, millennials have a very, very slow life plan, right? So what do we see? Average age for first marriage, right, or is 28 for women, 30 for men. So again, think about how different that is from the silents, right? Where the silents, it was at its kind of lowest point was about 20 years old for women, and half of new brides were in their teens, right? So we're now moving, almost a decade later, right? So we've moved this number for women up about a decade, and for men, not almost a decade as well. Okay, so we've seen, the percentage of, never married people, 25 to 29 has increased as we're talking about the millennials and then into the kind of beginning points of when we'd expect Gen Z to be getting married and when they're in that age range, right? So fewer people in that range, of, married is going down, never married is going up. So yeah, where it was, say, 1970, it was almost 80%, of people 25 to 29 were married. By 2020, this had dropped, down to just under 30%. So marriage no longer what it was. Now this, by the way, just isn't made up for by cohabitation. We sometimes think, oh, people are just living together. Not entirely true, right? Cohabitation rates actually stagnate at a certain point as well. Okay, and then never married, right, obviously rises. It was at, in 1970, only 20% of those 25 to 29 had never been married. And by the time you get to, 2020, it's past 70%. It's probably 72, 73. So big differences, right? Well, what do we have here? 25 to 29-year-olds who are married by generation, right? It was 80% for the silents. And this is a slightly different age range. Right now we're 25 to 39. But now we're not even quite at 50%, right, for the millennials. And yeah, what is it? Percent of 25 to 34-year-olds with a certain living arrangement, so living with romantic partners, right, has been declining really since about here. So right around 1970. So fewer people are living with romantic partners. More people are living alone with roommates or with their parents. Yeah, that's a bad number. I mean, that's a slow climb. It's not super steep. So there's just a lot of people, a lot less people who are living with a romantic partner, right? So even cohabitation, we're not seeing as much. Okay, so what does this all kind of carry through for? 1 in 4 millennial women had never been married by their late 30s. It was 1 in 18 for boomers, and 30% of men in their 30s are never married, right? So it's doubled up what it was for the boomers. That's my sister right there. 1 in 4, never married. Take that. She was mean to me when I was a kid, and she said I'd never amount to anything. And that hasn't driven me my entire life at all. I make more money than her. I'm married. I have a nicer car. My house is better. I have a hot tub. It's not like that haunts me every night of my life. Okay. I'm kidding. My sister's great, except she's never married and never will be, because she's impossible to live with. Okay. So, all right. Yeah, I'm going to stop. She might hear this someday. I don't want her to. Or maybe I do. Revenge. Seriously, she was so mean to me. She did tell me when I was like 8 years old, she's like, I bet you'll be borrowing money from me for the rest of your life. I have never forgotten it. And I've never borrowed a penny from her. And I never will. Because I'm richer than she is. Okay, it's all good. All right, so some experts think, 1 in 5 women, about 20%, are never going to get married. And some, pretty decent percent of those will also never have children. Yeah. And the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds living with a partner has also declined, right? So you're just not having relationship formation in the same way. Fewer people are, here it would have all been marriage. But even if you count cohabitation, right, here is a lot lower than it was in the past. Okay. Average age of the first of mother at the birth of her first child, in the early 90s was 27, right? So we're talking typically about the baby boomers. Sorry. Average age of birth for a child was born in the early 90s. So sorry, this is millennials. This is the kind of tail end of millennials. It's 27, right? So they're having children. I read that wrong. They're having children relatively late, right? 27. Now, this has a lot of possible impacts. This inherently is going to cause a lower birth rate, right? So we roughly think of, what we call the fertile range as being between 15 and about 44. But once you get past about 30, somewhere between 30 and 32, fertility starts to decline for women. It becomes, and men as well, but not as much, and it becomes much harder to get pregnant. So most women, by the time they hit 35, are going to struggle to have a child. So what it means when you have, more people above this kind of line than below it is that you have less time to have kids, right? And there is a sort of natural cycle, right? It takes 9 months to have a baby, and then it takes usually people wait a little bit before they get pregnant with another one. So there's a sort of delayed cycle of somewhere between 1 to 3 years between children for most people, which means, the total number of children that you could have if you start at 27 is just much lower than if you were, in the silent generation, you start when you're 20, 22. So, the total number of children naturally goes down the later you start having kids. Okay, and what Twenge will say is that slow life and individualism are the likely causes. And again, this makes sense, right? When I described the silent generation, the boomers a little bit, it was you get out of high school, you go, you get a job, you marry your high school sweetheart, or at the very outside, right? You go to college, fewer of them went to college, and upon graduation, you got married, so you're getting married about 22, and you're probably having your first child a year or two after that point. When you kind of spend 4 to 6 years in university, you're kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit in terms of childbearing years. There's other cultural factors with the millennials as well, is they undergo a sort of inversion in terms of their thinking, right? So one of the reasons we see this number, which by the way, just in case you're wondering if you were, same thing as Generation X, right? Average age of first marriage is 28, average age of first child is 27, which means there's, significant number of women having children before they're married, perfectly normal, but it's definitely an inversion from past generations. So that is definitely quite different. But yeah, there's also an inversion that goes on in terms of values, because one of the things that happens to millennials when they leave university is they want to establish their careers prior to marriage and kids, right? So marriage, which used to be, I don't have anything to write on here. Marriage used to be kind of, people would get married and build their lives together as a couple. Now it's like people establish their life and then they get married, and people call it, increasingly marriage, instead of being kind of the entrance into adulthood, is the capstone for adulthood, right? Once you get everything done, then you get married, right? As sort of the crown you put on top of your head to say, I've really made it as an adult. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, I don't know. I have a question slides here somewhere. Okay, so religion. Kind of generation on generation. I was just actually looking at a piece from one of my favorite researchers, Ryan Burge, on this today about Catholics, and specifically looking at how, the different generational cohorts of Catholics. But what you see, kind of broadly speaking, is true across the board. It's true for Catholics, a little bit less true for evangelicals, but definitely true for most other religious groups, is a declining religiosity over time, right? Okay, so I've got my handy dandy chart. So if we look at, just these kind of 3 measures, and these are all, so these 2 are religious behaviors, right? Praying and attending religious services are behaviors, and believing in God is a belief, right? Typically when we talk about measuring religion, we talk about the 3 B's: belief, belonging, and behavior. So these are measures of, 2 measures of behavior and 1 measure of belief. So kind of good ways of measuring things. Okay, and what do we see, percent, and this is kind of contemporary, right, in 2018, but, millennials are the black line. Why did we have to be the black line? I don't know. It's because of our sunny disposition. Right, considerably lower than the other 3 generations ahead of them in terms of frequency of prayer. So they pray less. Belief in God is way lower. Somehow the lowest on any of these. We compare Gen Z. Actually, I could explain that, but it's not super important. Belief in God, the lowest of any generational cohort, including Gen Z, and attending religious services, also the lowest, right? So we see millennials very irreligious, and you see the kind of line, right? When you hit the millennial, it had been going down a little bit, if we look at belief in God, and then it just like craters once we hit the millennial years, right? For all of these measures, essentially, except for ever pray, because we only have data for the millennials I think this is monitoring the future. I cut off the bottom of that graph, maybe it's a general social survey. Whichever survey it is, it's either general social survey or monitoring the future. They didn't start asking about ever pray until, somewhere around 2006. So, but even then, it's been declining since then. Okay, so what we're seeing is increasingly the growth of a religious identity called the nuns. Just to be clear, it's not, sorry, I made a boo-boo with my silly pen. Because sometimes, I know it's written there, but sometimes people get this confused. It's not this kind of nun. It's basically a group of people whose religious identity is nothing in particular, right? So when they identify religiously, it's sort of a great religious meh, right? That's a technical term in sociology. Meh. No, I'm kidding, of course. But it's kind of an indifference to religion, right? So it's not atheism, it's not agnosticism, it's just nothing in particular. So we see a growth of the nuns amongst millennials and an increasing group of what are called cradle nuns, right? So cradle nuns are people who were raised by either their boomer or Gen X parents with no exposure to religion, right? They were raised as non-religious people fundamentally. So some of them defected, right? Some people went from Catholic or Protestant, mostly those two, to nothing in particular. But increasingly with millennials, we started to see, people who were born nuns and probably will die nuns. So what Twenge says is why is religion declining in popularity? Well, fundamentally, it's incompatible with individualism, right? A lot of what religion happens to stress, and we'll talk about this when we talk about religion and spirituality, is following rules, following someone else's moral order, following diktats from some other group, rather than, doing whatever feels right to you. So, because religion, isn't compatible with individualism in major ways, it ends up getting left behind, right? It's the one thing that a lot of people sort of will put to the one side. Okay. You want to know? Okay, fine. I can explain this. It's actually rather simple. It just happens to, it's just age, right? It just has to do fundamentally, whoops. I need my pen. Okay, I'm going to erase everything here. Okay, and then so I can write once again. Can I write now? No, I'm highlighting. That can't work. So why is this lower, right? And why is this lower? Okay, so what it fundamentally has to do with is aging a little bit. What tends to happen, right, is when people are living at home, right, there are going to be a number of religious people who, when they're living at home, right, up until somewhere between 16 and 18, 16 and 22, they're going to remain kind of quasi-religious in order to sort of keep peace with their parents who are religious, right? Because they haven't quite differentiated their beliefs from their parents, which tends to happen once they're a little bit more independent, right? And especially once they move out. There's good evidence that, romantic partners, especially romantic partners that aren't religious, drive this to major extents as well. But basically, for most of Gen Z here, they're still pretty closely attached to their parents. As they move into their 20s, they're going to go through a period of sort of disattachment from their parents, right? Where they're going to start to set their own beliefs, right? Maybe if they go off to college or university, they're separated from the communities they grew up in that were sort of holding them into religious beliefs. And so they're going to, become less religious as they move through their teens and into their 20s. Some of that depends on parental religious behavior, right? If parents are really insistent through their teen years that they continue to attend religious services, the religiosity is going to last a little longer. But once they're out on their own, they start making their own choices about it, it's going to decline. So what's going to happen to this bar, right? As of 2018, you have a good chunk of Gen Z, about 5 years of it, that are above 18. And a few that are just 18 that were born in 2000. So you really only have the first chunk of Gen Z, 95 to 2000, that are even going to show up in the sample, right? So it's really only 5 years. For all of these people in the sample who are being measured here, that religiosity is going to go down as they continue to move through into emerging adulthood and all of that fun stuff. So I would say this number is a little bit higher than millennials. It's probably going to end up quite a bit lower, or about the same as millennials if you think we've kind of hit the floor of religiosity, which I don't know. I'll say that. I teach a whole class on sociology of religion, and I will tell you, I have absolutely no idea how to predict what's going to happen in the future. Because every time I've been like, I think this is probably the floor, it goes lower. But that's just me, right? So they're just young. They're going to disaffiliate from religion as they move into their 20s in pretty considerable numbers. So that's why. Okay. How would nuns be different from atheists? Okay, I mean, basically, there's a lot of, atheist is a fairly positive sort of identity, right? You're going to identify positively with something, right? You're going to say, I don't believe in God. That's an atheist, right? Or I don't believe in gods or any kind of deity. It's sort of positive statement. For a lot of the Gen Z, like I said, it's just meh. You ask them, what do you believe? They're like, I don't care. I don't know. There's a lot of I don't know, and I haven't thought about it, or it doesn't matter to me. Some of them would be kind of agnostic, but a lot of them just are like, I don't care. I haven't given it any thought. I don't, it's not important enough for me to take this very positive stance of atheism. Some of them might even believe in a sort of vague deity, right? Oh, I always save this story for later on. We talk about moralistic therapeutic deism. But I remember a friend of mine died, right? He was 32 at the time, overdosed on Oxy. I've seen some dark shit, guys. You think, a white professor, probably super privileged. I've had 3 different people I know die of drug overdoses. So, you don't know where I came from. West End of Edmonton, actually pretty privileged, but I've had friends with pretty fucked up lives. Anyway, he died, and I remember going to his funeral, and not a religious person. I think he would have positively identified as an atheist, and the rest of his family, I think, were more like nuns. And it was funny because I remember his sister giving sort of a eulogy at the funeral home, and her thing was because she remembered him as a kid loving Ninja Turtles, which is the weirdest thing. So many people were that was the memory that stuck with them, was when he was 6. And I'm like, I really hope that doesn't happen to me, because I was bratty and annoying when I was 6. So I hope that's not the image people carry with me and talk about at my funeral. I don't know what they'll talk about, but I don't want it to be that I loved Ninja Turtles when I was 6. But anyways, his sister, the statement she made is I'm sure you're up in that Ninja Turtle blimp in the sky. And I was like, that is a really, really strange idea of the afterlife. That what you get is, you're fixed at 6 years old for all of eternity, and that heaven is some sort of Ninja Turtle airship. Okay. And but this is the nuns, right? They don't have a really defined religious belief. It's like maybe there's an afterlife when it suits me to believe so, but it's not defined, it's not theologically coherent. They really don't care about religion and they're not going to come back to it. It's not like they got that in a church. They got it in nowhere, right? Kind of pop culture, what's heaven? Maybe it was like a Robin Williams movie, I don't know. Or, like The Good Place is where they get their theology of what the afterlife is like. That's the nuns, right? They just don't really have a sense of religion. But it's not that they're atheists. They might be like, I'm sure everyone goes to heaven. What they think heaven is, I have no clue. But it's always really interesting to talk to people because they'll give you stuff like Ninja Turtle blimp in the sky, and there you go. Okay. Where's my... Man, I really buried that deep. Okay, I'm like, where did I bury these things? I have interactive things I promised you, and they're still a ways away. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm like, I've been talking for 46 minutes, and I want to kind of break it down. Okay, talk a little bit more, because what I do have coming up is a little bit more about morality and these sorts of things. Okay, so I'm going to take a bunch of data here about the millennials. And again, why I think the millennials are important is specifically because I am one. No. And of course, my generation. Someone asked me, what do I think the best generation is? Millennials. What do I think the worst generation is? Gen Z. In a lecture I did. No, I'm kidding. Why I think millennials are important is because we gathered so much information about them. We have such a rich pool of data on millennials. Okay, so this information about millennials comes from a book. Specifically, this is from a book about the millennials when they were sort of making the jump out of, the first of them were making their jump out of college, right around 2005 to 2007. The book, so it's Christian Smith, and this one is Patricia Snell. It's called Lost in Transition, about this kind of move from, kind of late adolescence to emerging adulthood for the millennials. And all part of a big study, which you'll hear a lot about if you hang around me for long enough. You'll get sick of hearing about this study because I talk about it all the time, because it's probably, I think, one of the best kind of sociological studies ever done, the National Study of Youth and Religion. It doesn't hurt that I'm a sociology of religion nerd, so it gave me years worth of content to read and think about and lecture on. So I love it. Basically, a kind of a 4-wave study now that ended in 2015, but only the first 3 waves were included in this data, following basically young Americans through their teen and early adult or emerging adult years. And basically it's longitudinal, so they followed the same people roughly through the different ways of the study. Started with 2,700 surveys and almost 300 in-depth interviews. The number goes down as each wave goes on because they lose people. But basically, really, really kind of interesting study. So a bunch of the rest of this is going to come from there, right? Okay, so yeah, these are the 4 waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion. And you can see the kind of different points at which they were picked up. You don't need to know, you don't need that for exam purposes or anything, but just so you kind of know. Okay, so what were the millennials like in roughly 2010, right? So kind of at the end wave, of this study, this wave of the study. Okay, so their lives had been marked, according to Smith and Snell, by a whole bunch of transitions, right? So, and lots of transitions, often unanticipated, as they sort of struggled in those emerging adult years. They've moved out, they've moved back in, they move out again, right? They go off to college, they move out of their parents' house, they move back in when they're trying to find work, and then they move out again in kind of various chains. Sometimes we'll talk about this when we get to families, but sometimes this got termed the boomerang kids, right? Because they go out and they come on right back. So the millennials got this kind of tag. They went to college, they went to university, some of them took a break, some of them graduated, some of them didn't, right? A good number of those who started in university programs didn't actually finish those programs, dropped out, switched career paths, right? Switched kind of schooling. As they were kind of going into their late teens and early adult years, a lot of their parents got separated and remarried, right? Because especially once kids were out of the house, parents who had been sort of holding it together for the kids were like, fuck you. No. It's kind of though, right? They'd been holding it together, and once the kids were out of the house, it was like, well, I don't like you anymore. I'm out of here. They take jobs, they quit jobs. We'll talk about this when we talk about work as well, right? Millennials and Gen Z, as they enter the job market because of their position, they're in and out of jobs all the time. And, you know, as they've moved from high school to college and back into the workplace, they transition friend groups multiple times, and multiple relationship transitions, right, as they start their romantic lives as well. Okay. Sorry, this is this 18 stickers to share with all your grown-ups, right? So all the things that you're supposed to do as an adult. Okay, so as they're coming out of college, right, they want to stand on their own 2 feet, entering emerging adulthood. You know, they're transitioning from dependence to independence, but it was really, really difficult, right? Specifically, one of the things that happens, especially when you leave high school and go into college and then beyond, is you go from a period of really, and maybe some of you can relate to this, you go from a time of really structured life, right? Where your time as a late adolescent is highly structured, right? You're in high school, so you have classes yet you're expected to attend, right? Unless the truancy officer show up. Your parents have enrolled you in extracurricular activities. You may have a say in it, you may not, right? You're on sports teams. Your time is highly structured. And, you know, the choices you can have in high school in terms of classes you have to take, relatively limited. Once you get into college, right, or university, a lot of that structure breaks down, right? You can take whatever classes you want. Your professor doesn't care if you show up to class or not, right? For the most part, you know, for most of us. It's nice when you're here. I like it. But I'm not taking attendance. So your time is relatively unstructured. And in some ways, you know, as you enter adulthood, for most of you, your parents kind of ease up on the controls a little bit, right? They have concerns, they have worries, you know, they check up on you, but they're less controlling about where you spend a lot of your time than, you know, when you were 16, right? They kind of start to treat you as an adult and they ease off the controls. Okay. But, you know, still needing a lot of guidance. This is the kind of time where, you know, young people, especially once they move out, start to, you know, navigate a whole bunch of adult things, right? You can call it adulting, right? I won't write it, but adulting, right? These are all the things that make up adulting, paying bills, fixing things, you know, getting insurance, romance, you know, figuring out how you move through life as an adult with a lot less of that support, right? Paying your own cell phone bills, paying your bills on time. All of these things start to be things that young people transition into as they move, especially beyond the college years. And generally, you know, struggling because you feel broke when you're young, living paycheck to paycheck, and things can be a little bit of a struggle. It's all that avocado toast. If you just cut down on avocado toast and matcha lattes, you'd be fine. Okay. So, according to Smith and Snell, millennials were super optimistic. Happy smiley face. So millennials, I think I mentioned this last class, so I won't dwell on this too much. Compared to Gen Xers, even to the baby boomers, millennials had been raised in this culture where they were told that, A, they were super special, you know, the most special snowflake that ever did snowflake in the whole wide world, completely unique and wonderful, and told that their future was bright, right? This is a generation that was told, you can be anything you dream, just put your mind to it, and ultimately you will succeed and everything will be happy-dappy, clappy-lappy. That's a technical term as well, right? So, no, I'm kidding. Right, this is a generation that's very much told, I'm not bitter about this, it's a pretty great way to grow up, told, you know, that you were going to succeed if you just worked hard enough, right? And a lot of millennials in 2010, you know, as the bulk of them are transitioning to adulthood, you know, we're like, okay, I'm not where I want to be, right? I want to be, you know, middle class. I want to be wealthy. I want to have, you know, you know, some kind of spouse or romantic partner and some kids and a dog. Weren't quite there, but they still believed that they were going to get there, right? For the most part, right? If we talk about the bell curve. At the kind of bottom end of the bell curve, there was a chunk of millennials who felt that they should be optimistic, right? That's the normal frame that everyone around them ultimately had, but they didn't quite feel it, right? They were sort of like, I'm struggling to be optimistic. It's kind of hard to think life is ultimately all that great. Okay, now, that said, it's not because millennials didn't go through some stuff, right? Millennials, like every other generation, struggled mightily with lots of things, right? Especially in the emerging adult years, right? Lots of them had parents who were alcoholics or had, used drugs, lots of addiction kind of problems, their own or other people's. Sexual exploitation, right? Something that definitely happened. People experience sexual abuse, sexual exploitation. As they get into romantic relationships, they have lots of sexual experiences that they don't really, really care for. Divorces, typically of their parents at this point. Their own divorces will come later. But their parents getting divorced, relationship breakdowns, having to navigate that. And the millennials dealt with a lot more divorce than other generations had of their parents, right? Because, being that they were born, kind of the earliest part of them were born in 1980, the real spike in divorce starts around 1985, 1986. God, I can write today. Jeez, I'm having a hard time. Right, so lots of that. Relationship betrayals, right? People cheating on them and breaking up with them and all those sorts of things. Accidents and injuries, things that kind of change their life in major ways. Academic failures, right? Especially as they go into college, and that transition isn't always a smooth one. Job disappointments, we've all had that, right? You get your first job or your first job out of college, and you're super enthusiastic about it, but it turns out not to be great, and then it's hard to launch in the marketplace. I'll talk about this when we talk about work, but millennials had a really hard time launching in the marketplace, right? And getting beyond those kind of entry-level jobs for a long time. And then, a smaller kind of minority, parental abandonment, right? People being abandoned by one or both of their parents. Racism, especially obviously for minority students. And, deaths of friends, especially as they get into their kind of 20s. They see more kind of death of their friends, and definitely into their 30s for sure. Okay. So, no shortages of bad experience or challenging experiences, but millennials still ultimately pretty cheerful. And so what Smith and Snell will say, it's also a generation categorized by this particular sentiment, which is no regrets, right? So, which is actually a really interesting and I think somewhat functional kind of way of looking at the world. So, when the millennials, they're very forward-looking, and one of the kind of ultimate statements, right? When they think about the bad things that have happened to them or mistakes they've made, one of the phrases that Smith and Snell ran into over and over is, yeah, it was unfortunate, but it made me the person I am today, and I wouldn't change it if I could, right? So even bad stuff that happened to them, ultimately, they didn't regret because it shaped them in particular ways, right? So, basically, they weren't weighed down by the past, right? Even admitted that they were responsible for things that happened to them and didn't ultimately dwell on it, learned from the past and moved on. And again, it was, so Smith will say, that admitting to having regret was equal to capitulating to sort of self-doubt. And this is not something the millennials ultimately could deal with, right? Because it was, the whole process of living and these bad experiences was discovering or becoming or emerging into who you were. So ultimately, even the bad things that happened to millennials, they ultimately put kind of a sunny face on, right? They lost the house. That first relationship with, Sheila broke down. All of that stuff shaped you into the person you are today. Okay. So here's a question for you. I want you to answer this as honestly as you can, knowing it's completely anonymous. Because we want to talk about the moral lives of millennials in particular, you're all Gen Z, but I'm kind of curious where you sit on this. It is immoral to cheat on a test even if you know you won't get caught? I'd like you to pick one of these options. I'll give you a couple of seconds. And the reason is, like, we'll talk about how this relates to millennial kind of morality, and you can see in kind of straw poll terms where you fall on the kind of millennial morality axis. I promised there was interactive things. Only 20 people logged on. Oh, a sad state of affairs. I'm not checking my email. Oh, my bills are due. Super fun. All right. 23. Can we reach half of the people enrolled in this class? One more, please. All right. Let's see where you fall. Okay. So the majority of you are not millennials. You think that it's wrong to cheat on a test even if you won't get caught. All right. So, I mean, we're talking, maybe you're just telling me what I want to hear so I don't watch you too carefully on exam day. Now I'm suspicious of these results. Okay. We'll talk about the millennials in a sec. We'll get to that in a sec. All right. Well, keep that in mind because I want to talk about that in a sec. I put that slide slightly in the wrong place. It should be one slide forward. I forgot about parents. I'll tell you about parents really quickly. The millennials mostly getting their relationship with their parents improve once they emerge from the teen years. Most of them had pretty good relationships before, but once the parents start to kind of ease up and give them more freedom and treat them more as equals, those relationships get even better. However, a significant minority still have problems with their parents. I'll never forget John. Oh, John, he's in the book. This is one of the people who was interviewed, I think, in every wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion. And John, had a pretty terrible father who he occasionally, I just remember, his relationship with his father, because every now and then his father would come back into his life and they'd party it up. And on the last one, they went on a trip to Vegas together, which ended in John, his dad stole money from him at the table and John punched him out. So, there's still a significant number that don't have great lives. Okay, hang on. All right, I want you to answer this. So this is just like word cloud, right? So just throw this in here. How do you know what right or wrong is? Well, we'll compare you to our millennial friends. So how do you know what is right or what is wrong? What is your barometer for morality? The Bible. Okay. Religion. Interesting answer. God. What makes you feel proud about yourself? Very interesting. A mix of ethical teaching and moral compass. Context. Okay. So we've got two kind of, I would say, objective moralities. Oh, did you take SOS 100 with me? Mores, folkways. Intuition, context, God. If it's illegal, okay, the law. All right. Culture. Does it hurt someone? Oh, very interesting. Have you been looking ahead? Does it hurt someone? Did I miss one? If it hurts someone or not. Okay, interesting morality. Intuition, very interesting. So your morality is mostly based on intuition. Very cool. This is kind of fun. Society and or harm. Your mom told you. Very interesting. No, it's not a bad answer. Not a bad answer. I don't know why intuition is bigger. I can only imagine more than one person wrote intuition, which is why it's big and green. Notice how fast the Bible and God came up. And it's like everybody else is trying to figure it out as they go. Oh, come on. We got 24 for the last one. Come on. Give me a few more. You're shy. Maybe you don't know. One participant is typing. This has to be a really long answer. You've read Kant. I read Kant, or I read Aristotle, and I've committed myself to virtue ethics. The way you were brought up, okay, so hurt someone, the effects on both you, others, and yourself as morally right and wrong, mix of ethical teachings, your mom told you so, the way you were brought up, God, the Bible, society or harm, intuition, which again is big and green, What makes you feel proud? Experience, if it's illegal, does it hurt someone? Okay, so some themes here, and it's kind of interesting. Okay, so how do you compare to, I was a little bit worried when it started off with God in the Bible, because I'm like, you're so unlike millennials that you can't even relate. Okay, so really, really important when we get to millennials, there's a sort of cultural shift that happens. And you could properly call this, a generation that's deeply ensconced in kind of postmodernism and postmodern thought. Now, one of the things that I always think is interesting that Smith and Snell say in the book is that despite the fact that when it comes to, their knowledge of, say, postmodern philosophy, almost none of them, right, have read Foucault. Some of you will have read it. Or, Derrida, my buddy Jacques, right? Almost no millennials had actually read Foucault or Derrida or any of the postmodernists. But postmodern thought had sort of deeply seeped into this generation. So, most millennials were basically, I was going to ask you about objective truth, but I figured that might be too hard a question. Most millennials at this kind of phase in their lives, Smith and Snell will say, are basically skeptics about the possibility of objective truth. To the point that, when they were asked about it, whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities or standards, or simply relative human inventions, most had trouble understanding what the interviewers were trying to ask. So this is one of those situations where, if you're in an interview with someone, they're not understanding your question, you try to rephrase, still not working, you try to rephrase again, they're still not really getting what you mean, and then you rephrase a third time, and then when they still are kind of struggling, you move on to another topic. You use a transitional question to move on to something else. But pretty much, millennials viewed themselves as being limited to their own perspectives, their own kind of subjective selves, right? So, and not sure that objective truth even exists or that it could be discovered at the end of the day. So, yeah, this is a quote, page 46 of the book. Seems they cannot, for whatever reason, believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, reality, or nature of the world that is independent of their subjective self-experience, and that in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change. Okay. So, right or wrong, and this is where your answers are a little bit interesting, right? Are easy to discern, right? Despite the fact that they don't have a sense of objective morality, that, right, well, two of you said God or the Bible, the rest of you, it was like what I feels, what my mom told me, right? So despite, and other things, obviously, right and wrong are easy to discern, despite the lack of an objective standard. So what did the millennials kind of think? Morality is sort of common sense. Now, people didn't say common sense. So, I mean, if we go back to your answers, right, this is an interesting one, because you're right there with the millennials. They know by attending to their subjective feelings or intuitions within themselves, right? So, what do we have? What makes you feel proud about yourself, right? That's a kind of subjective feeling. That I think maybe that was the only one in there. But yeah, it's interesting because it's subjective. It's about your kind of feelings. These seem to have been implanted in them when they were children by parents and teachers, right? That's why I said the person who said your mom, right? That's a pretty typical answer for millennials and kind of Gen Z. Where did you learn it? Well, it's, your parents, teachers, society, right? All of these sorts of things. However, they view thinking and living morally as relatively effortless. It's kind of easy because what you do is you kind of attend to your feelings, and you're okay. Okay, again, you said some really interesting things. Core to kind of millennial understandings of morality, do no harm. And I don't know if people were looking forward and just stole this kind of answer, or whether it was organic, because I have no way of knowing that. But no harm, was a key principle. So millennials ultimately end up being what are called moral consequentialists, which is a sort of school of kind of moral thought. right? We can break it down into a bunch of different categories. When we talk about moral thought, you can either be kind of typically we would break it down into things like virtue ethics, duty ethics, or kind of consequentialist ethics, under which you might find things like utilitarianism. So virtue ethics is you do the right thing basically to foster certain qualities in yourself, and because it leads you to live the good life, right? So if we talk virtue, though there are slightly different schools of virtue ethics, my screen shakes, you'd be looking at, say, Aristotle. So if you've taken philosophy and they made you read, the Nicomachean Ethics, right? This is virtue ethics. Or other schools, right? The Stoics, right? So people like, it's a different school, not Aristotelian, but the Stoics, right? This would be like Marcus Aurelius. They have different ideas of what virtue is than, say, Aristotle, but still it's a form of, you foster certain qualities in yourself which help you live the good life, right? So that's virtue ethics. Duty-based ethics. Whoop, what did I do? I killed it. I killed what I was doing. There it is. All right, so duty-based ethics, right? So duty, you'd be thinking here like, we had two people answer, God and the Bible, right? So especially the kind of God answer is a duty-based ethics. Why do you do what's right? Well, because, you have a duty to your deity, right? You live in a certain relationship with a deity, and therefore you do what they command, right? So you have a duty to obey them. And then where millennials are is what's called moral consequentialism, under which there's a whole bunch of schools. One of them is utilitarianism, though I wouldn't say millennials are necessarily utilitarians, right? But how do you know, what is right and wrong? Well, basically an action is right or is wrong, it's immoral if it harms someone else. So, interestingly, and why I say it's interesting that you all thought it was wrong to cheat on a test even if you wouldn't get caught, for millennials, in large part, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong, right? It would only be wrong if it's harming other people. So if you knew you wouldn't get caught, as long as, say, you cheating on the test isn't hurting other people in the class, right? If you say the class isn't on a bell curve, it's just whatever you get is whatever you get, you're essentially serving yourself, right? You're not hurting anyone else, so it's not wrong. Now this one, and this is always a question, it would be an interesting word cloud in and of itself. Why hurting others was morally wrong, according to Smith, was something that they struggled to articulate, right? It seems to be a sort of free-floating assumption, right, that doing no harm is good, it's just common sense, but why harming other people is bad was something that millennials struggled to articulate. And yeah, some minority had kind of quasi-religious notions that you should do good things because, the universe is cyclical, right? You do bad and it comes back around to bite you. A sort of pop culture notion of karma, right? Not the kind of Hindu or Buddhist notion of karma, but the notion of like, okay, that you do enough bad things, you put bad out into the world and bad comes back. You put enough good out in the world and good comes back, right? That basically the universe kind of functions on a karma, but it's a really pop culture-y kind of way of understanding the world. Okay. Well, here, I got a few more slides on millennials and then we'll be done with this talk. Well, we'll do Gen Z, which will be pretty good, but we'll take a break after I'm done with millennials. Okay. I know, you're like, you've spent over an hour talking about yourself. And I have. And it's great. And I love my job. Okay. Millennials. A deep and abiding moral relativism, right, is pretty common for millennials. And here, this kind of statement, what's right versus what's wrong? Well, everybody's different, but for me, right, I can't say that whatever's good for me is good for everyone, right? And nobody can impose their perspective on other people. That's intolerance, that's bigotry, that's being judgmental, and all of those things are bad, right? There are no objective standards for morality for most millennials. It's very much socially constructed or relativistic, right? So it's not right or wrong, it depends, right? And so it could be right for you, it could be right for me, but it might not be right for Tim, right? Tim might have a different view of what's right and wrong. And every individual, right? So you see the individualism, right, that Twenge's talking about creeping in generation to generation. every individual is different, and every individual has to decide morality for him or herself, right? So a lot of morality for millennials ends up being ad hoc, right? So in the moment, right? You're making moral decisions in the moment rather than relying on, a code, right? Where you would find a code, say, in virtue-based ethics or duty-based ethics. In consequentialism, you're always like, okay, is this hurting people? Is this getting me ahead? All of that fun stuff. And it plays out in really weird ways. Okay, so generally speaking, when it comes to, say, LGBTQ rights, and I've said this before, by emerging adulthood, millennials were becoming much more tolerant of gay and lesbian people. And then, as time goes on, bisexual, transgender people, and, the panoply of others with LGBTQ plus identities, right? Millennials, they hit emerging adulthood, and they were kind of intolerant in high school, especially the older cohort. It becomes more normalized to be tolerant. And really, they kind of move away from a lot of, homophobia. Homophobia goes from normalized to very much taboo with the millennials. They're very liberal on the use of substances, right? So, they use a lot of drugs. Millennials use a ton of drugs. Most of them stick to marijuana, but there's a lot of experimentation with all sorts of drugs, rivaling the experimentation that went on with the boomers in lots of ways. And it becomes, yeah, please.
In terms of substance abuse-related deaths, how do millennials compare to, let's say, baby boomers?
In the teen years? I mean, when we get into kind of our 30s, it's way lower than the boomers. I can't remember. I'd have to check on the substance use-related deaths in the kind of teens and emerging adult, because I don't have that information right off the top of my head. Let me make myself a note, and I will. Where will I make a note? Hey, Google. Oh, of course, now you don't work. Hey, Google. All right, I'll make myself a note during the break. Stupid Google, you usually work. I've locked my screen. Okay. All right, but yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'd have to look up the answer to that because I'm not 100% sure on it. But yeah, they use a lot of substances in their teens. Again, mostly related to marijuana. Marijuana is the most common one. Most people don't use anything beyond that, but some percentage go into harder drugs from there. And, millennials, because they became when they become sexually active, they tended to think that made them more liberal or open-minded, and that kind of reflected, in their treatment of LGBTQ people in major ways, right? And especially, sort of moving away from religion as a sort of way of thinking about sex and morality, right? Once they transgress a lot of religious norms around sexuality, well, then the doors kind of swing open. They think they're very open-minded, and they start to reject a lot of religiously based kind of concepts. Okay, in terms of their cultural relativism, what Smith will say, and again, not that they've read, say, someone like Peter Berger or even Max Weber, but broadly speaking, millennials are social constructivists. They believe, the social world is historical, it's contingent, it's socially changeable, it's invented by humans, shared values and norms mark things, but those norms are fundamentally changeable. And morality becomes framed in terms of subjective emotional terms. This is what makes me feel proud. And again, I'm not making fun of you. That's not a wrong answer. It's very kind of consistent with what, millennials and later generations will think. It goes from, I think that this is wrong to I feel that, ... kind of statements being really important for millennials. Morality is mostly couched in terms of feelings, right? Okay. So we talked about Gen X in terms of education, right? Gen X did this swap, right? It was really important to develop a meaningful philosophy of life to university, college are all about getting that job that makes you the money. And millennials are very much a continuation of this, right? Education is of instrumental value, right? It's no longer that it helps you become a better person or connect with a historical tradition. It's about getting a job, right? You're here, most of you are here not because, you wanted to study the works of Shakespeare or Aristotle or any of those things, or Dostoevsky, all of which are wonderful, but you're mostly here because at the end of this 4-year degree, you get a piece of paper that says you're real smart. You managed to survive 4 years of being told what to do and turning in assignments on time, which is going to make you a fabulous employee over at Acme, Anvil Corporation, or wherever you end up working. And so you're all about that credential, right? It's like, Shakes who? I don't want no Shakespeare. I just want that sweet, sweet degree so I can go off and live the rest of my life and acquire stuff and all that jazz. And again, I'm making fun of you slightly, but this is true of millennials as well. It's something that, education really is just for getting ahead in life. Okay. Oh yes, drugs. Despite, I say this jokingly, and I haven't taught it in a couple of years, but when I taught Youth, Crime, and Society, which is a fun course to teach, excuse me, one of the things that I went through was all the anti-drug campaigns of the 80s and 90s, especially as the boomers and Gen X did a lot of drugs, and then they were like, wow, that really did not work for us. So in the 80s and 90s, they had these like very pervasive anti-drug campaigns from government, especially as drugs got to be more and more potent, things like crack in particular. They had all these anti-drug campaigns, which are always really fun to watch. But yeah, millennials mostly just ignored that. And there's some evidence that actually those anti-drug campaigns were like, wow, if my teachers and the government are working so hard to keep me off of drugs must be really great, right? It must actually be really awesome if adults are trying to keep me from them. Millennials did a ton of drugs, especially marijuana, right? That was the drug of choice, especially in the emerging adult years. Once they got out of college, though, most reduced or got bored of taking drugs. Marijuana persisted for some percentage. But once they kind of get a job, drug use declines, except in a certain portion of the population. Okay, and I think I got so many more slides on millennials. Okay, I got a couple more slides. I'm sorry. I spent years putting this together. Okay, so kind of like Gen X, right? And we talked about this a little bit already. Settling down is for later, right? When millennials thought coming out of college what their life plan was going to be like, what they thought of was, youth, your 20s, was a time to find your passions and secure yourself as an individual, right? Got married later in life than their parents did. Once you were done this, then you could move to this. But career, stability, and income come before marriage and children. So marriage and children are last on the list. Okay, and millennials definitely have display a preference for sort of detachment in relationships, especially in those emerging adult years, right? So this is where we get things like hookup culture, right? And we'll talk about hookup culture when we talk about sex and intimacy. It's a really interesting sort of cultural phenomenon. But it is all about detaching feelings and sex, right? And this was really, really common for millennials, that, sex comes before feelings, and you should have a lot of sex that's not attached to any feelings before you ever get to here, right? Before you ever get to this place, there's a lot of sex that has nothing attached to it, especially in college, right? Your goal is just to live your best life, sow your wild oats, if you will. And this is really unleashed with the millennials, right? Okay, and yeah, relationships become weird for millennials. So I think I kind of laid out where, for the silent generation and the boomers, there was a pretty consistent progression of relationships, right? Where you went from dating to, whatever dating to going steady to, engaged to married in a really standard progression. And everybody kind of knew what the social script was, right? And it was very linear, right? So for the silents and the boomers, and a little bit for Gen X, it gets a little bit more scrambled for Gen X. Relationships were kind of a straight line where you knew the starting point and you knew the end point And it all kind of made, and all the points in between were kind of, they made sense, right? So I'm going to draw for you very carefully and in great detail what it looks like for millennials. It gets really, sorry, I was going to say a bad word, really messed up, right? And a lot of that kind of linear pathway through, maybe I should put an arrow on it to make it seem like it's directional. That didn't help. For millennials, and I think increasingly for Gen Z, and we saw this a little bit with Gen X as well, relationships become really amorphous and there's no clear progression. Things get stuck in weird places, right? And, so you get things like, you go from friends to hanging out with sex or friends with benefits, dating, friends with benefits, all sorts of gradients get created by the millennials for where their relationship is. And so it becomes really complicated and people end up really confused, right? And this is sort of the marker of relationships for a lot of millennials, is they're really confused as to where they are. And often people have different kind of understandings of where the relationship is. One person thinks you're just here and one person thinks you're here, right? You're friends with benefits. One person's like, no, we just hang out. I just hung out with her. That's all, right? It gets really, really confused and really messed up. So you have to create whole new kind of categories, right? Things like define the relationship talk is common for millennials. Is like, so what are we? Like, are we just friends or are we dating, right? A really common experience for millennials in relationships. Partially, again, driven by this detachment, right? People, and it becomes a sort of, I don't want to say moral good, but a sort of relationship good to remain detached. And one of the clearest ways that you go from, in some kind of relationship with someone, say friends with benefits, to that person no longer acknowledging that you exist, a phenomenon called ghosting. I know I don't have to tell you that because you all know what that is. Is to be too clingy or to be like, so what is our relationship actually? And then that person vanishes into the mists of time, forgotten, their name stricken from every tablet. Yeah. And hookup is a weird one. We'll talk about hookups. It ends up being defined really broadly. Anything from kissing to sexual intercourse can be counted as a hookup for millennials. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. Okay, so is it the end of marriage? This is a question that lots of people were asking of the millennials, right? Especially as they moved through their 20s and started going into their 30s, and a lot of them remained unmarried. Is it the end of marriage as an institution? As one person on Twitter so eloquently put it, I don't know that they're a millennial, but probably, marriage is antiquated patriarchal bullshit, right? This is something that became sort of a common meme for a lot of millennials, right? So most millennials, on the whole, tend to want to, if you ask them what their preference is, cohabit before marriage to test out relationships, right? I can't count the number of times that I've heard people say, well, you wouldn't, oh, sorry, it makes me chuckle a little bit because it's such a horrible metaphor. Well, you wouldn't buy a car without test driving it, would you? And it's like, human beings are not cars. Like, it's a horrible metaphor. Like, what's involved in test driving a human? Ugh, what a sad metaphor. But millennials wanted to test drive it, and especially, right, reflecting on their parents' divorces. They had been burned by their parents' divorces, and they did not want that to happen to their own children or to themselves. So they wanted to mitigate as much risk as possible. And yeah, so test driving the relationship was living together. All right, a couple more. I just got 2 more slides, and then we'll take a break, and I'll leave a participation slide up while you're on break. So what's the good life for millennials? Well, in a lot of ways, it's consume, right? Consumer culture is the culture they expect to live in, and living a good life is a life of consumption, right? Owning lots of stuff, taking lots of trips, having the means, especially to purchase or own anything that you want to purchase or own, comes to be seen as kind of the good life for American millennials. And, is it moral to buy anything you want? Well, as long as you can afford it, you're totally entitled to buy whatever you want, right? So what's the problem? Less common, right, for millennials is this notion that we should take care of each other, that we should have, high taxes in order to make sure that, that people are cared for and all of those things. But most millennials feel that taking care of each other, so volunteering, donating, and actually helping people was something they would do later in life, right? So it's like, live your fun life in your 20s, go on your trips, discover yourself. And again, once you're established, once you've got the job, the career, the kids, and all of that, well, then you can think about donating money and helping people. But those initial stages is all about you. Oh God, I'm so totally getting why Twinkie calls us Generation Me. It makes perfect sense. This isn't even Twinkie. This is Smith and Snell. And yeah, I mean, what do most millennials aspire for? It's that middle class life, right? It's the house. It's the 1.4 kids, the dog, or increasingly 7 dogs and no children. The Audi and the Acura SUV and all that jazz. It's a middle class life. It's the good life. It's lots of vacations. It's being able to go to Europe. That's the good life for millennials. Okay. And so most of them, again, pointing to this cynicism that Twenge talks about, most of them doubted their real power to change the world, right? To make the world a better place. So while they think the world is socially constructed, they feel kind of powerless to change those social constructs. And millennials, again, because we're me, right? Millennials is me. Not really engaged in a lot of ways with, the major intellectual or cultural or ethical debates facing, American society in this case, but I think that's true for Canada as well. And very few of them had a sense of what the common good was. And I think interestingly, especially compared to, and you saw this, right? I talked about this when we talked about the shift from boomers to Gen X, right? Gen X was that first generation that didn't serve in the army, right? In large numbers, right? Where the draft had disappeared and the army became, fully sort of volunteer. This goes along with a shift away from a notion of duty and the duty of a citizen, right? Citizenship, and what the duties of a citizen are ultimately kind of disappear for millennials, right? And John F. Kennedy in his very famous speech, in his inauguration, said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And millennials were like, nah, that sounds boring. I'm going to ask what my country can do for me, not what I can do for my country, right? And so it becomes very much, the relationship to the state is about the state providing services to them, but not their duties to other people in the country, and certainly not about adding something to the country themselves. Okay, much of this is because they're deeply engaged in their private lives, right? Their personal lives, interpersonal relationships become paramount. And increasingly, with the rise of social media, much of it looks like it's managed through technology. Okay, perfect. We're at a break. What I'll do is I'll leave this up and go take a break. Let's come back in, shall we say, 53? Should I say 53? 2:53. It's 2:33 now. Let's take a 20-minute pause. So yeah, about 2:53. Come back, and while you're waiting, you can write what you feel is a definition of the common good. What does the common good entail? And I'll be curious to see your answers. Alrighty. All right, let's jump in here. Okay, so I know this is a hard question. Interesting kind of. Oh, one more person is typing. I should wait. Well, I'll talk while this is going on. Interesting kind of definitions here. A lot of this is, obviously a little unfair because I'm talking about, just throwing a concept at you. There's some interesting kind of answers here because if we look at, say, all of these things, a lot of them, come close to kind of classical definitions of, say, what the common good happens to be. So, and only 10 people answered this time. Oh, very nice. Okay, so I'm not sure why individuals would be there, but it's kind of interesting, right? Public benefit, right? The good of the many, what's good for the most people. Utilitarianism, the most good for the most people. You're on that. This is always the problem with utilitarian definitions of the common good. Is what if it was good? There's 5 people on one train track and 1 person on another one. Is it okay for you then to redirect the train to hit the 1 person because technically, right, the good of the many outweighs the needs of the few? That tends to be a common problem with utilitarian sort of definitions. But what's good for most people, right? Things like well-being, betterment, those fall into kind of a almost Aristotelian notion of eudaimonia, right? Which is the common good is happiness, well-being, and flourishing as generated by societies for the good of all, right? That can be shared in by all citizens, but for whom all citizens also have a duty to get the common good for anybody. And so I think it's kind of interesting here, one person, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait? One person said duty, right? Duty is always a really interesting and important part of the common good because in kind of classical definitions, because the common good can't emerge without the help of the society. A lot of things, though, improvement individuals are on this list are kind of utilitarianism got moved when I did that. Are kind of things that benefit the individual, but does it benefit the common, right? And no one put citizenship, right? Duties of citizenship or the nation state or the government, which is kind of interesting. I guess you've all lived a good chunk of your lives under Justin Trudeau. So maybe you don't trust the government. Well, you'll come along nicely. I'll bring you along to my position where you can't ever vote for a mainstream political party. It'll be great. Okay, so let's move on to Gen Z, because Gen Z is an interesting one. And we'll see if we can get in to talking about families today. Otherwise, we've got lots of time to do families and education on Wednesday, because they're short units compared to this one. Okay, so I already introduced to you Jean Twenge a little bit, right? Professor at San Diego State University. Notable, and a lot of the data on Gen Z from her going forward is coming from the book we've been talking about, Generations, and from this book, iGen, right? And she's a generational, researcher. Oh, she's so mean to millennials. She wrote 2 books about us compared to only one about Gen Z. Okay, so the generation that the book iGen is focused on, and a lot of her work on Gen Z comes from, basically takes its name from the technology, right? So she's a technologies model, right? Technology. That's what defined generational cohorts. So she thinks that, specifically the internet, but more so the pervasiveness of the internet as it has come from the smartphone era ultimately is what defines Gen Z, which is why she wants to call it iGen, right? Now, it didn't really take off. She pushed this for a few years, right? She wrote the book in 2017, and she pushed, and one of the things she says in iGen is that generations often are named by other generations, and eventually, once they come into their own, they give themselves a new and better name. So she thinks that the name Gen Z kind of stinks, and I would tend to agree with her. And she suggested that this generation should be called iGen, specifically, from Apple's now somewhat abandoned naming convention of calling everything connected to the internet an i something, right? So you had your iMac, and then your iPod, and then your iPad, or iPhone, and then the iPad. After which point they sort of abandoned it and went to Apple as their naming convention. But before that, right, the I was in everything, and the I always stood for internet, right? So why the internet? Well, because, this is a generation now born, do I have it on the next slide? Oh, I don't. I didn't put the dates. But basically, she puts iGen, or Generation Z, as being born between 1995 and 2012. Now, some people will put 2010. My daughter, she's only 14, so what does she know? But she insists that Gen Z has to end in 2010 because her brother, who was born in 2012, can't be the same generational cohort as her. She does not like him, and that's okay. But roughly speaking, right, and because we're still sort of living, in a sense, in Gen Z, this definition is likely to change. Now, what you might notice is that this is as generational cohorts go, it's a relatively short one, right? You're talking 17 years in terms of how long this was. So it's relatively short, and this goes with Twenge's sort of notion that generations are getting shorter as the technology spins out much more quickly. But, all right, so 1995, right? Very importantly, that's the same year that the internet became commercially available. So for iGen, or Gen Z, this is a generation that's grown up their whole lives saturated with the internet, right? With the internet being everywhere. All right, so even more so after a very important year. And this so there's a couple of really important fence posts that we should talk about when it comes to Gen Z. So one of them is here, right? This is 2007. So in 2007, what happens? Steve Jobs in his, jeans and turtleneck goes up on the stage at what's called Apple World at the time. And, he gives his one more thing talk, and what he introduces is the first iPhone, right? The first iPhone comes out in 2007. And while it isn't an immediate success for lots of reasons, within a couple of years, it's a huge success, right? Now, why does the iPhone matter, right? Because it isn't the first smartphone, right? There had been smartphones before. Nokia had smartphones that ran an operating system called Symbian. Microsoft had smartphones that ran Windows something, Windows Mobile, I guess at the time it was called. BlackBerry had been around for a few years, and they had smartphones that could access the internet and check email. Well, the big difference is that Apple is basically a consumer-focused company, right? And while lots of business people eventually adopt the iPhone, almost everybody has one now, or some kind of smartphone, previously to the iPhone, smartphones were super expensive and they were targeted not so much at consumers, but at business people. Like, I remember this because I was working prior to the launch of the iPhone, and it was all the executives at the company I worked for, which you will hear about later, because I have ongoing trauma from my time there. I still have nightmares about working there, actually. Like, just last semester, I had a nightmare where I was somehow back working there. It was very traumatic. But you'll hear about my horrors later on. Everybody, all the executives had them, but what was the focus of it is, oh, I can answer email on the go, right? So the BlackBerries had a small screen and a very big click keyboard, right? But it was very accurate. So, they were business focused. The iPhone brings it to consumers, right? And the goal is to get a mini internet-connected computer into everybody's pockets, right? And so very famously, right, Steve Jobs, the first iPhone prototype, had a plastic screen. He walked around with it for a while with his keys in his pocket. The screen got all scratched up, so he switched it to glass, which arguably, given how much I've paid to replace screens over the years, was a terrible choice. Yes, it doesn't get scratched much, but it also shatters at a shocking rate. Okay, so 2007 is an important date, right? It's because that's when this technology comes into the popular consciousness as something that everybody should want, right? And it comes with that kind of degree of Apple cool at the time. Apple, I don't know, to me now it seems like a very stodgy company, but at the time, like in 2007, it was the hip upcomer, right? It had launched the iMacs, which were these very colorful computers, and they had huge success with digital music players called iPods, which were so much better than the Zune that I had. What a fool I've been. Anyway, I loved my Zune actually. But the iPods were the hip thing that everybody had, and they had those iconic white earbuds, and everything really transformed things and moved, smartphones into the, internet era. Data plans became common, right? And by a couple generations, everybody was getting an iPhone. Okay, so by about 2012, and this is an important date, about half of all Americans owned a smartphone, right? And when we get to the unit on mental health, youth and health, but it's mostly now just a mental health unit. 2012 ends up being a really important year because you can kind of see it on the charts where a lot of things start to change in 2012. So half of Americans own a smartphone. It's about 75% of teenagers that own one. And in that emerging adult cohort, 18 to 29, it's about 94% of them end up owning a smartphone by about 2012. Because it is the hip new technology. Okay, so all of that, very important. There's other important dates, right? When the iPhone 4 comes out with its front-facing camera, the same year as the Galaxy S. This is also important, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so Gen Z or iGen, right, is I think so far, and we're still just now getting data coming in on their successor generation, what some people are calling Gen Alpha, other people are calling them the Polars. I don't know what name is going to shake out. Both of them stink. I don't like either of them. Like the Polars, what does that even mean? Are they the ones that are going to get eaten by the white bears? I have no idea. But right, these are the two names that have been sort of thrown out there for people born after 2012. Is either Gen Alpha, I guess you finished with Gen Z, you ran out of alphabet, so then you go back to the beginning, but you choose the Greek alphabet. So there you go. I can't wait for Generation Lambda. That should be real fun. I don't think that one's going to stick. But Gen Alpha is what a lot of people are calling the next one. Okay, so what are the kind of traits of this particular generation? All right, so iGen, she suggests, is obsessed with safety, both physical and mental. And this is, this gets talked about by a whole bunch of people, not the least of which is her close friend and collaborator, Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt, is pronounced Haidt. I'll spell it for you. Jonathan Haidt. We'll talk about him later in the term. Who also writes a book. We're going to talk about his book, The Anxious Generation, but we're also going to talk, or we're not going to talk about one of his other books that he wrote with his friend Greg Lukianoff. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind. And in The Coddling of the American Mind, amongst very interesting, very, very good book. But amongst other things, what Lukianoff and Haidt will suggest is that Gen Z, because of the way they were raised, comes to see almost everything as a threat, including speech, right? And this, Haidt will note in The Anxious Generation is a weird shift, because the millennials, right, when they were in their college years, they were pretty open to all sorts of speakers coming in with all sorts of disruptive ideas, right? Right wing, left wing. They were just open and kind of happy to hear about different people's ideas. And then Gen Z showed up on the campuses of major American universities, and they saw ideas that they disagreed with, or ideas that challenged, especially their identities, as dangerous. So this is where the kind of phenomenon of cancel culture comes from, where students start to protest even the presence of people with ideas that they don't agree with. And it's, for good or ill, it's a major shift in terms of thinking that, safety has to include the physical and the mental, and that you can be put at risk by ideas that you don't agree with. Okay, Gen Z, broadly afraid of its economic future, much less optimistic than the millennials, and really worried about all sorts of things, climate change included, and worried that they're not going to have a place, worried that the economy doesn't serve them. And, this is kind of, I think, the apogee of the shift that started with Gen X, carries through the millennials a little bit, but then really finds its kind of, I said apogee a moment ago, with Gen Z, of that economic inequality, that rising inequality, really worrying them about their potential future. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to correct this. I put this in last term, okay. So iGen, or Gen Z, has no patience for inequality based on gender, race, and sexual orientation. This is a very tolerant generation, and the only thing that they can't tolerate is intolerance. I think I got that right. Okay, right? Intolerance is not tolerated, but everything else is tolerable. All right, can I throw tolerance in one more time before I get to the end? No, I think I'm good. All right, so, yeah, and I mean, what Twenge will say is they're growing up considerably slower than previous generations. They get their driver's licenses later than Gen X and millennials. See, this is where Gen X and Gen Z are too close, and I misspeak all the time. It's annoying. iGen gets their driver's licenses later than Gen X or millennials did. They date later. They get their first jobs later. They have sex later, right? And in these kinds of statistics here, 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than in 1991. And by the way, that has continued to go down. Yes, sir.
Is there any data on when they get their jobs, around the ages that they can?
So, I mean, there's a ton of variance. It looks like they start working more towards the guy 18 to 21, right? And a lot of them will not work at all through their kind of high school years, right? Some of them, the really privileged, won't really start working much until they get out of college altogether, right? If they have fairly wealthy parents, and a lot of them do. But the average is sort of, after they finish high school. It's much more typical. Driver's licenses is a completely wonky thing. It's like 19 is kind of the average, but the average is climbing upwards, right? And more Gen Z are just choosing not to get driver's licenses at all. So there's lots of stuff going on. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, sex. Why are we all obsessed with it? I don't know. It's Freud's fault. I'm going to say that. 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than 1991, and this number has continued to go down since then. And we'll talk, when we talk about sex and intimacy, about what people are calling the great sex recession. Everyone is having less sex, but Gen Z, the least sex of anyone. And I know that probably seems counterintuitive, but it is not. Or it is true nonetheless. And this number, which I think no one should feel bad about, because it's actually great. Not only because my daughter's going into 9th grade, but 50% fewer ninth graders had sex than in 1991. So, and we should feel not terrible about the fact that less 14 and 15-year-olds are having sex, because that was terrible and should never happen. And like I said, I'm not saying that only because my daughter's 14 and going into ninth grade, but that is 100% the reason. Okay. And yeah, interestingly, rates of going out without parents have dropped off as well. And this is just, they just don't go out at all. Increasingly, right? Gen Z increasingly just stays home all the time, doing things at home where their parents are, which sounds super cool. Okay. I have these charts, right? These are fun. So things that they do, right? And we can see the kind of declines in general. Lots of things have declined, but working for pay, right? So basically, fewer of them work for pay, and this is 8th, 9th graders engaging in adult activities. So that's pretty young, right? That's like 14, 15. We see, working, having sex, dating. They don't even date, right? They don't even get into dating relationships or tried alcohol, have all declined pretty steadily. But the percentage of 12th graders kind of dips off as well, right? So we see tried alcohol, that's the dark line. It's been declining pretty steadily since the 90s, but it drops really hard right around 2012, the year everyone has an iPhone. Weird. Work for pay, right? All these things kind of drop off in significant numbers, right? And this just points to a generation growing up more slowly and having fewer real world experiences, right? Things that, we'll talk about this when we talk about Jonathan Haidt's work right at the end of the course. He's really big on a difference between, experience-based childhood, what he calls play-based childhood, and phone-based childhood. And he thinks phone-based childhood is really bad because you get less experiences, you take less knocks, which makes you more worried about the world. Okay, so we'll talk about the mental health crisis for Gen Z in lots of ways, but yeah, it's pretty acute, and it's not just reporting. We'll talk about that later, but it's definitely there. Okay, but they're physically safer, right? All of these things are true. They smoke less, they do less drugs, they drink less, and they drink later. They're less likely to drive hazardously, right? They're safer drivers, although fewer of them drive at all. They're not likely to get into a car driven by someone who's intoxicated. They're less likely to be murdered, less likely to fight, and their parents know where they are 3/4 of the time, and who they're with 65% of the time, right? This is all smartphones. But as I like to joke, the reason for all of this is, that at a certain point, it appears for Gen Z, Netflix and chill just became Netflix, right? It's like Netflix and chill used to be, oh yeah, come over, I'm going to pretend to invite you over to watch Netflix, but really we're going to have sex. And now increasingly it looks like it's like, actually, let's both just stay home and watch Netflix by ourselves. That sounds like it would be better and easier. And maybe, no, I shouldn't give away the game, but maybe I'll masturbate to porn instead of having sex with you because that's easier too. Bet you never thought you'd hear that in a university classroom. Oh, you're going to hear so much worse. But Netflix and chill, right, has become Netflix and Fortnite and Minecraft and Rocket League and X number of other things that people do. Instagram for girls, right, that their whole lives are lived online. Okay. All right. This is also important, though. Oh, because millennials and Gen X, the parents of Gen Z, are such absolutely god-awful parents. Sorry, I say that lovingly to myself. They give their kids a lot less independence, right? And we'll talk about this. Like I said, Haidt makes a big deal about this in his book, and I was initially kind of offended, but I'm increasingly sort of convinced by it, to be honest. Things like, we talked about this for Gen X, right? They were the latchkey kids, and they were given a lot of independence. And okay, it didn't always turn out great. Some of them got pregnant. A lot of them had sex, but they had a lot of real world experiences. And the reaction to that seems to have been like out of school care, after school programs, and never letting your kids experience anything because they might get hurt and something bad might happen to them. So Gen Z has been given a lot less independence, even just like the ability to walk home after school if you go to a community school has been cut down fundamentally. And trust me, I mean, I have kids in school who I do not pick up very often, and my wife is an elementary school teacher, and the dark phenomenon of the Lululemons, hovering at the school, dropping Precious Angel off at school in the morning and picking them up 2 minutes after the bell because God forbid they be alone at home for 5 damn minutes. It is not a thing. Not going to happen. This I will tell you. This is a term my wife coined, and I'm going to make it popular. I don't know why. I love it, and I will write a book someday to popularize it. I don't know how, but this is my only goal in life, is to make Lululemon a popular culture term of derision. I want to replace Karen with Lululemon. That is my whole goal in life, because I actually think the Lululemon is worse than a Karen. But anyway, apologies to those of you wearing Lululemon. You're terrible. No. It's just that at my wife's school, they used to hang out like literally right by the office so they could hear all the gossip with their Starbucks and their Lululemon pants. And it would just drive my wife absolutely crazy. And she termed them Lululemons because she's like, they have nothing to do but drink Starbucks and gossip and, hover over everything that happens to their child. Like, they would sit outside and like watch their kid at recess. And it was like, you need a life like right now. Okay, have an affair. Do some coke. I don't know. Like, it's terrible advice. Please don't follow that. But I think that was my advice. I was like, well, don't they have affairs and like do coke in their spare time? It's like, no, they just sit there and watch their kids. I'm like, cool. Sounds amazing to be that person's child. All right, my parents were very negligent. All right, so I'll put it this way, I spent a lot of time alone at home, so it's all good. All right, so gender fluidity, big change for Gen Z, and this is coming out of the book Generations. When it comes to kind of transgender rights and ideas about gender, Gen Z is a completely different world from every other generation, and it's really, it's kind of interesting, right? It's a really, really big change, and Gen Z just seems to be so much more willing than any other generational cohort to play with gender norms, right? Okay, so now overall, right, 2/3 of young adults, so if we talk about kind of tail end of millennials and Gen Z, have become more supportive of transgender rights in the last 5 years, which is really kind of the period in which it's become a public issue. As it's become a public issue, millennials, Gen Z have become much more kind of supportive of transgender rights in general. But for Gen Z, they spend much more time thinking about gender than any other generation, right? And this, you can see this in the proliferation of terms that they use to talk about gender. And this is not by any means a exhaustive list, but things like non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer, demi-boy, demi-girl, and many, many others, really are, for the most part, though again, they're getting this idea from things they've never read, and from things that other generations sort of pioneered, right? You've got your Judith Butler kind of influences in here. Again, if you've taken kind of upper level theory courses, that name will be familiar to you. And so many others, right? Queer theory and all of these things. But it's seeped down now in the way that postmodernism seeped into the experiences of millennials in major ways, even though they've never read those texts. Queer theory and sort of feminist, like third wave feminist theories of gender have really bubbled down into Gen Z in major ways. And they're much more willing to play with gender norms. Okay, so what do we have here? Adults identifying as transgender and percent identifying as non-binary, right? So we see Gen Z, right, like the Aladdin song, it's a whole new world, right? Way larger percentages than any other generation. We don't even have the silence on here, but because we can assume that number is very, very low, or they're just not polled. But you can see the kind of the metrics completely different. And percent of U.S. adults who believe there are more than 2 genders, right? So, and this is separated by years, and you can see that this has increased over time, but it hasn't increased that much, right? Silence actually went down. That's fun. So the silent generation, right, about 30% say there's more than 2 genders, which actually went down. Boomers at about the same level. Gen X, started out lower, but actually have come up a little bit, but still they're in the same ballpark. Millennials, I would say same kind of ballpark, but you see Gen Z, right, slightly different ballpark, much faster rise, and that jump, from from 2019, again, this is only 3-ish years, so from early 2019 to late 2020, early 2021, seen a really, really big jump. So there's definitely something shifting about when it comes to Gen Z and their notions of gender. Okay. Oh, this is a fun, random question. That should have been like one slide earlier. When did you get your driver's license? And I have way too many options because this is bad survey design, which you can learn about in my class, Intro to Social Methods, which I will teach next winter. Or if you're Sarah, you're like, I already took that class. And you recognize this is actually terrible survey design, but I did this in about 8 minutes. And I'm actually just kind of curious, when did you get your driver's licenses? Okay. Wow, do not have a driver's license is winning, or 16 is winning, but do not have a driver's license coming in a close second at, better than a third. Now they're neck and neck. I honestly got, now, uh-oh. What's happening? Okay, so a fifth of you that voted, this is not the whole class, a fifth of you don't have a driver's license. A third of you got it when you were 16. Good on you. I got mine on my 16th birthday, and I was like off to the races. And I thought it would make me more popular with girls, and that was a very flawed assumption. But I did give a lot of girls rides home after school, so that kind of played out. Sort of. Didn't really work, but, it's a good theory. And yeah, a solid, almost fifth. Yes, I'll tell you all my horror stories. I was not the cool kid that I am now. I am not cool now. But yeah, I mean, a solid fifth looked like they got it like 18, 19, so once you reach adulthood. But it seems an even split, roughly, between I got it right when I could, and yeah, I still don't have it. So, interesting, and that kind of backs up, I think, what Twangie's saying. Okay, I don't know, like I said, clearly that one landed a little bit funny in terms of where I put it. Okay, so my friends in Gen Z and gender. All right, so again, lots of interesting stuff when it comes to gender and Gen Z. Oh, it kind of like, there's some, what do they call it when you use a lot of the same syllable? Anyway, I can't remember. All right, so Gen Z and gender. Okay, the proportion who identify as transgender has increased the most amongst those who identify as assigned female at birth, though it's increased a lot in those seeing their assigned male at birth. And this is kind of weird, right? So this is not in like a moral sense, but it's kind of an interesting sociological thing. You can see, the kind of difference in generational cohorts, right? So people who are transgender, right, male to female, historically, when we think of people who are transgender, or people who are, what they would have called transsexual or cross-dressers or whatever it happens to be, historically, right, it was a phenomenon dominated by men, so that's the gray line, who wanted to, transition or act in the manner or take on the gender norms of women, right? That's historically been true, right? And even like a lot of the historical examples we have, of people who we would think now in kind of retrospect as transgender, were men who, wore women's clothing particularly. It kind of evens out amongst millennials, right? Where then, the proportion of those who are transgender, who are male to female transgender or female to male transgender, assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, is roughly even. And then, the overall proportion increases in Gen Z for both, but the proportion of those, assigned female at birth jumps up in a way that's really interesting, right? And I think remains really difficult to explain sociologically. There's definitely some interesting things going on. Non-binary, same kind of thing, right? We see a big jump. It's actually kind of even in every generation, but when we hit Gen Z, assigned female at birth who identify as non-binary jumps pretty substantially. And this bottom 1% of US adults identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, we see a huge jump in female bisexual, right? So for whatever reason, it jumps, generation to generation. Gay jumped most for millennials, but then it's about the same for Gen Z. Lesbian jumped a bit for Gen Z. Male bisexual took a big Gen Z jump, but nothing compared to female bisexual, which just takes a huge jump in Gen Z. And there's possible explanations for that. But it's definitely an interesting kind of shift, right? And what's really interesting, it's increased across rural and urban divides and across political lines, right? So it's been a relatively uniform shift where Gen Z all at the same time have shifted their kind of understandings of gender and sexuality. And I think, all right, another question for you, because I'm curious about this one. All right, because we're talking about Gen Z and we're almost done talking about Gen Z. Marriage and family are extremely important. Do you strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, or strongly disagree? Much better survey design, by the way. Which again, I did in about 30 seconds, but this is a much, much better survey design. Ah, perfect. All right, 21, 22, I'm curious. All right, well, I'm going to say 21's all we're going to get. Okay, so really interesting. Still about, what do we say here? 68% say marriage and family is extremely important, with, a fifth, almost a quarter, saying they don't agree or disagree, and 13% saying they disagree that marriage or family is extremely important. Okay, so how do you line up with kind of Gen Z in general? Okay, so, basically we see pretty consistently, I keep tripping on this cord, which I think my laptop battery will last till the end of class. I'm just gonna throw it on the floor. Yeah, like millennials, right? Marriage and family seem to be things that people still want in pretty strong proportions, right? So about 75%, so you aren't too far off, say they're still likely to get married, right? They still want marriage. And you're kind of in this range. We said did we say 68%? Now 65. Okay. Say marriage or family is extremely important, right? We're in that same kind of range right there, as what, this was found in Monitoring the Future. So roughly speaking, you're pretty typical as a group, but it's declining, right? Fewer and fewer people are feeling like marriage and family are extremely important. And, okay, so marriage and long-term relationships and children are all things that, that should be Gen Z, that's a typo on my part, think are for much, much later. And this may in some ways be a good thing. And I kind of said this, right? A lot of sex ed programs we think of as targeting like teen pregnancy. Teen pregnancy is at an all-time low. Gen Z has the lowest birth rate for teens and early 20s that we've ever seen, recorded since we've been keeping records. And we've been keeping records on this stuff for, about 225 years. So we've kept these records for a really long time. And what we see is the lowest kind of recorded birth rate for this cohort, which again makes sense, growing up slow, access to birth control and all those things, but it's a major shift and it has major societal impacts. Okay, and then why is Gen Z so fascinated with gender? Well, you're Gen Z, you tell me. It's an interesting question, and I shouldn't make fun of it. I make fun of everything, so that's kind of how things go. I think the most common thing my daughter says to me is, "You're so mean. And your sense of humor is so mean." And I'm like, yeah, that's me. Okay, so why are they so fascinated with gender? It seems to be just a societal shift, right? It's something that got stuck to use a word, the zeitgeist, right? For whatever reason, these kind of questions around gender hit critical mass with Gen Z, and it became something that, this generation was, I don't want to say obsessed with, but became really salient for Gen Z. And these things sort of happen generationally, right? Sometimes, questions like divorce, marriage, all calling yourself a dog mom when you have a dog, hit this sort of mass where people become really interested in it, and gender seems to be that for Gen Z, at least one of the things. Self-definition, individuality, having to define your own identity in very granular ways, right? If we move across this spectrum from the silence where that starts and the boomers, Gen X, millennials, where it all gets more intense, Gen Z is at the highest point or the apogee of that, where they're really questioning identity and they have to define their identity down to very granular things. I mean, arguably, a lot of the things that used to define people too have broken down, right? If you want to think millennials, not very religious, Gen Z's looking like it's going to be even less religious. So how do you make meaning out of your life? How do you define yourself as a person? Used to be done through community, now it's all done individually. And then you get this kind of idea coming in of gender as a social construct with all these categories, and people start to define their identity that way. So I think that's probably a big part of it. You'd want to say too, as society gets more tolerant, more people that might have felt that way also are going to, start to openly talk about it. And as that kind of hits critical mass, it becomes an idea that more and more people can accept and more people just kind of, I don't want to say vibe with, but let's go with that. Okay, mental health. This is a bad chart. Gen Z and mental health. Percentage reporting, they are unhappy, right? Okay, so what do we see here? Basically, it kind of here, we're topping out just in the kind of mid-20s, right? Around 25-ish%, a little bit lower. But basically, across, here, these are, I don't know why the UK is missing on this chart. But if you add the UK, these are what we called Anglosphere countries, right? And they're all countries that either, essentially are English speaking and have ties to Britain. Mostly colonial ties. In the case of the United States, obviously they split off, but they still have those kinds of ties to kind of global Anglophone culture. And what we see across the Anglosphere, but we're seeing it in other places too, it's the same story if you look at the Nordic countries, is Gen Z are reporting much higher rates of unhappiness, right? And it's sort of, Canada, for whatever reason, Australia is this dark dotted line. They were kind of unhappier already in the early 2000s, but we hit, kind of around between 2005 and 2012, and everybody sort of takes a jump, right? Young people reporting that they're unhappy takes a jump. We'll talk a lot about this through the course, and especially in the unit on mental health and on the anxious generation, but this is, a really interesting phenomenon, and it's not just reporting and people being more willing to talk about mental health, because there's a lot of markers that go along with this, things like self-harm, suicide attempts, and this stuff that have gone along with it that are very objective measures. Okay, is this my actual last Gen Z? Okay, this is my actual last Gen Z slide. Wow, that took way longer than I thought. Okay, so I love this slide. This suggests that everyone agrees with me. So 6 out of 10 Gen Zers disagree with the statement that America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead, right? So 60% of Gen Zers don't see America as a fair society, right? So that's right here. If you look at this chart, and you can see the difference generationally, right? Older people tend to think that in large majorities, America is a fair society where people could get ahead. It crosses the 50% line with millennials, and then Gen Z, you're off to the races to about 60%. As it 3/4 of Gen Zers, and this is a really, I want to say a scary statistic, but it's a really interesting one. And this is here. Think we should tear down society and start again. That kind of contemporary American society or Western society is so unfair that it should be torn down, and we should, take it down to the studs and rebuild it, completely. 4 out of 10. Now, by the way, this is if we're going for what name I think Gen Z should have, I like this one. Zoomers. I don't know why. But then people tell me that it has a sort of trauma because, of the pandemic and spending half of your educational lives on Zoom. But I like it because it sounds zippy and fun compared to Gen Z. What's that? Well, maybe a little bit, but Zoomers also, I don't know. sounds nice. It kind of combines Gen Z with something that sounds better. Okay, but anyway, they describe the founders as villains rather than heroes, right? So, and you can see how much of this has shifted, right? Basically, none of the silence would say that the founders, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and all those folks were villains. And again, this is all American data. Similar things would happen if you went in Canada and talked about like John A. Macdonald and all those folks. All right, very few of the older generation would think of them as villains, much more likely to think of them as heroes, but Gen Z has a much more negative take on them. Okay, so what do we see here? Jumps in things like hard to have hope for the world, right? For Gen Z, up to 40%. Wonder if purpose to life given world situation, right? What's the purpose of life? They don't know. And this is 12th graders, right? So 12th graders increasingly don't feel like there's a purpose to life and find it hard to have hope for the future, which is obviously bad. Fewer of them now, though it's still a majority, expect a professional job. That's been declining for a while. Expect to graduate or a professional degree, again, declining, and expect to own more than their parents. Really tough, right? And I mean, part of this is their parents owned a whole lot. All right, so generally, increasingly negative views about capitalism. Only a slim majority of Gen Z have a positive view of capitalism. And they tend to perceive discrimination, and they perceive what's called an external locus of control, right? So they see the world as very discriminatory and very racist. And really importantly, and we'll talk about this again when we talk about mental health, I don't want to give too many like trailers and promises of things, but Gen Z has shifted from an internal locus of control, which is I control my own fate, I am in charge of my own destiny, my hard work, my effort can pay off, to a lot of thinking that the world is against me and there's nothing I can do to change things. Okay. Who wants to end 10 minutes early? Yeah? Okay. Anyone vehemently opposed? No. Okay. Why don't we end 10? I mean, I could start another unit. We'll get through both the remaining units and if we don't, whatever, I can shift around what's on the exam really, really easily. Okay, so we'll leave it there. We'll do families and we'll do education on Wednesday. And like I said, they're both shortish units, so they should go pretty quickly. And I'll talk about the exam that's coming up the Wednesday after, at the beginning of the class or midway through on Wednesday. You're free to go. We will see you on Wednesday. It's hard for whatever reason.